You are now in the deep end of horror.
Hello, my children of the popcorn. It's Thrill Me Thursday. And Drew over at Hey, Isn't That Devon Graham challenged everyone this week to pick 5 movies that you love that other people hate. And he didn't mean specifically Roger Ebert, but I've chosen to do this on Roger Ebert. These are 5 movies that I really enjoy that Roger Ebert hates, and they're all in this book. And I've included the trailers for the movies, and over the trailers, I've recorded his review, excerpts from his review, because they are longer than 2 minutes. Roger Ebert hates Day of the Dead. Roger Ebert hates The Hitcher with Rutger Hauer, which I consider a classic. You might assume that it would be impossible to steal a scene from a zombie, especially one with blood dripping from his orifices, but you haven't seen the overacting in this movie. The characters shout their lines from beginning to end, their temples pound with anger, and they use distracting Jamaican and Irish accents until we're so busy listening to their endless dialogue that we lose interest in the movie they occupy. Maybe there's a reason for that. Maybe Romero hasn't figured out anything new to do with his zombies. This time, though, Romero has centered the action in a visually dreary location, an underground storage cavern. The zombies have more or less overrun the surface of America, we gather, and down in the darkness, a small team of scientists and military men are conducting experiments on a few captive zombie guinea pigs. It's an intriguing idea, especially if Romero had kept the semi-seriousness of the earlier films. Instead, the chief researcher is a demented butcher with blood-stained clothes, whose idea of science is to teach a zombie named Bub to operate a Sony Walkman. Meanwhile, the head of the military contingent, Joseph Pilato, turns into a violent little dictator who establishes martial law and threatens to end the experiments. His opponent is a spunky woman scientist, Laurie Cardeal, and as they shout angry accusations at each other, the real drama in the film gets lost. In the earlier films, we really identified with the small cadre of surviving humans. This time, the humans are mostly unpleasant, violent, insane, or so noble that we can predict with utter certainty that they will survive. According to the mad scientist in Day of the Dead, the zombies keep moving because of primitive impulses buried deep within their spinal columns. Impulses that create the appearance of life long after consciousness and intelligence have departed. I hope the same fate doesn't befall Romero's zombie movies. He should quit while he's ahead. What is particularly sick about The Hitcher is that the killer is not given a viewpoint, a grudge. He is deliberately presented as a man without a past, without a history, who simply and cruelly hurts and kills people. This unhealthy bond between the young hero, played by C. Thomas Howell, and the older killer, the cold-eyed Rutger Hauer, is developed in a movie that provides a horrible fate for its only major female character. As Howell flees down empty desert highways from the violence of Hauer, he's befriended by a young waitress, Jennifer Jason Leigh, but the movie does not develop into a standard story of teenagers in love, and the Leigh character's death, she is tied hand and foot between 2 giant trucks and pulled in 2, is so grotesquely out of proportion with the main business of this movie that it suggests a deep sickness at the screenplay stage. There are other disgusting moments, as when a police dog feasts on the blood dripping from its master's neck, and when Howell finds a human finger in his french fries. The Hitcher grants the Hauer character almost supernatural powers. Although that makes the movie impossible to accept on a realistic level, it didn't bother me. But on its own terms, the movie is diseased and corrupt. I would have admired it more if it had found the courage to acknowledge the real relationship it was portraying between Howell and Rutger, but no, it prefers to disguise itself as a violent thriller, and on that level, it is reprehensible. Roger Ebert hates Piranha, which is so much fun. How could you even hate on it? I walked into Piranha wondering why the U.S. government would consider the Piranha to be a potential secret weapon. After all, I reasoned, you can lead the enemy to water, but you can't make him wade. I was, as it turns out, naive. Piranha is filled with people who suffer from the odd compulsion to jump into the water the very moment they discover it is infested by piranhas. Consider, for example, the case of Kevin McCarthy. He plays a government scientist who has developed super piranhas, which can live in salt or fresh water, reproduce with amazing speed, and are smarter than your average fish. If anybody knows how dangerous these piranhas are, Kevin McCarthy does. And yet, when a little kid's father falls into the river and is gobbled up, and then the kid is clinging to the top of an overturned canoe, and Kevin McCarthy sees him, what does Kevin McCarthy do? Why, jumps in the water, of course, and swims toward the kid, and is eaten. He is the first of many victims. By the time this movie is over, half a kid's summer camp and 3/4 of a crowd of potential homesite buyers have been eaten alive. That often happens to potential homesite buyers, but for the kids it's rotten luck. There they are, the little tykes, splashing about in their inner tubes when the deadly piranhas attack. The kids bleed a lot, and people in the audience cheer a lot, and finally there is this to be said. It is the nature of a piranha to eat flesh, so the piranha can be forgiven. But why is it in the nature of a movie audience to cheer? This movie has really bad special effects. We kind of expect that, though, since it's hard to actually show thousands of tiny fish ripping people's legs apart. It's a good thing that it's hard too, because if it were easy, the producers would have shown it. Because it's so hard, what we get instead is a weird noise on the soundtrack, and what we see are dozens of piranhas that share a curious trait. They all swim at exactly the same speed and without moving anything. That's probably because they're phony little models being pulled through the water. The movie's plot is mostly an excuse for showing people thrashing about in bloody water. When it gets more specific, though, it turns out to be a rip-off of the first two Jaws movies. Roger Ebert hates Friday the 13th Part 2. The pre-title sequence showed one of the heroines of the original Friday the 13th alone at home. She has nightmares, wakes up, undresses, is stalked by the camera, hears a noise in the kitchen. Through the open window, a cat springs into the room. The audience screamed loudly and happily. It's fun to be scared. Then an unidentified man sunk an ice pick into the girl's brain, and for me, the fun stopped. The audience, however, carried on. It is a tradition to be loud during these movies, I guess. After a batch of young counselors turns up for training at a summer camp, a girl goes out walking alone at night. Everybody in the audience imitated hoot owls and hyenas. The legend grows that the son Jason did not really drown, but survived and lurks in the woods waiting to take his vengeance against the killer of his mother. And against camp counselors in general, I guess. That sets up the film. The counselors are introduced, very briefly, and then some of them go into town for a beer and the rest stay at the camp to have sex with each other. A mystery assailant prowls around the main cabin. We see only his shadow and his shoes. One by one, he picks off the kids. He sinks a machete into the brain of a kid in a wheelchair. He surprises a boy and a girl making love and nails them to a bunk with a spear through both their bodies. When the other kids return to the camp, it's their turn. After almost everyone has been killed in a disgusting and violent way, one girl chews up the assailant with a chainsaw, after which we discover the mummies in his cabin in the woods, after which he jumps through a window at the girl, etc. About 24 movies a year feature a mad killer going berserk, and they're all about as bad as this one. Some have a little more plot, some have a little less. It doesn't matter. Sinking into my seat in the movie theater from my childhood, I remembered the movie fantasies when I was a kid. They involved teenagers who fell in love, made out with each other, customized their cars, listened to rock and roll, and were rebels without causes. Neither the kids in those movies nor the kids watching them would have understood a worldview in which the primary function of teenagers is to be hacked to death. And Roger Ebert hates Prom Night. And I'll have a special note about Prom Night at the very end of this. Prom Night is merely an execrable movie, not despicable like I Spit on Your Grave. Well, Prom Night was playing on a double bill with I Spit on Your Grave, which had been held over after the reviews hailed it as one of the sickest movies of all time. Anyway, back to Prom Night. The plot is simple. A bunch of little kids semi-accidentally cause the death of a playmate and vow to keep the secret all of their lives. Then we flash forward to their senior prom as a maniac killer stalks and kills them. Who is the killer? The movie makes it painfully obvious very early on, and then insists on boring us with repeated shots of another suspect. It's as if we know who the killer is, but the movie doesn't. After an endless hour of build-up, the night for the prom arrives. And the killer, dressed in black and with a ski mask, starts the killing spree. To the terminally bored audience, every killing was an occasion for screams, laughter, and applause. To call such a response cretinous would be generous. One typical killing went this way: bloody murder, followed by a loud disco song, and a cut to a blood-red bowl of punch. Why do people go to these movies? Probably because they've been browbeaten by the hard-sell advertising exploitation campaign on TV. It's easy to make a great-looking 30-second TV spot, so why bother making a good film? If you have an appetite for violence and the macabre, at least try to satisfy it in a movie done with artistry and craftsmanship. Prom night should be cut up to make bookmarks. Here we go! Now, the special note about prom night: please turn this off now if you have not seen prom night, because this is a huge spoiler. But if you remember the ending of prom night, you remember the beginning of prom night, you know why the killer was killing. And if you think about it, the protagonist, Jamie Lee Curtis, our final girl, is not in any danger at any point during the entire film. She was never a target. So the movie is kind of pointless with her as the protagonist. I just thought I'd point that out. Everybody have a wonderful day. Thanks. Click like, subscribe, or even comment below, because I want to hear what you think.